My name is Joan and I'll be your host for this evening's program. Perhaps about a year and a half ago, in late 2017, you may have read some stories in the local newspapers about what was happening at nursing homes and elder care centers. And the news wasn't good. The news was, in fact, very, very bad. As a result of those reports, it was agreed by many people at the health department and citizens in general that something had to be done. A task force was established, and that report was written in very short order, and some legislation was proposed in 2018. It did not go very far, and we'll talk about why that was later on. But we have with us tonight a guest, Sean Burke, who's with the Minnesota Elder Justice Center, and he was involved in this process. And we're going to talk a little bit not only about what happened with the task force, but maybe some of the things that you might be aware of, either as a consumer of those services or as a family member. So stay tuned tonight to learn a little bit more about elder care and what you need to know to make good choices. Well, Sean, it was actually a very depressing read. Some of the things that happened to people, even where you think they're getting the best care in the world, were really very sad and very dangerous.
You're right, Joan. Our organization, Elder Justice Center, was one of 5 consumer groups that wrote the report. And we asked for feedback, or the organizations asked for feedback from the public, and that's where we got some of those anecdotes. And our organization responds to victims every day. We know that 1 in 10 older Americans suffer some sort of abuse or neglect or exploitation in their lifetime. That number jumps to 1 in 5 if they have a cognitive disability. And this issue is specifically focused on that abuse and neglect that happens in facilities, but it happens everywhere in our community. The fact that it happens in care facilities when we think our loved ones are being taken care of and they're not is incredibly depressing and scary.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the different kinds of facilities. I mean, I didn't really know the difference between an assisted living facility and a nursing home, and there are different kinds of facilities that have different rules and regulations too. Yeah,
it's very complex for regulators, for advocates, for the providers, so let alone the consumers. One of the ways to think about it is there's nursing homes, which are regulated by federal law.
So there's a federal law that says what you can and can't do at staffing levels and that sort of thing?
Yeah, it doesn't get into specific staffing levels, but it creates all sorts of kind of licensed rules and regulations, and also rights for the individuals in nursing homes.
And now, how do you define a nursing home? Because there are other levels of care.
So a nursing home, essentially, a nursing home is one that is that meets the federal definition, and so they have to then follow those rules, and then they serve people who need a certain level of kind of nursing care. Assisted living, or in our state, the way it's called and regulated, oftentimes is referred to as housing with services. For purposes of our discussion tonight, you can kind of think about those in the same way: housing with services or assisted living.
It's the same thing, but they're regulated a little differently.
Well, the reason there's some confusion is because every state regulates these type of facilities differently. And so every state has some version of an assisted living. Generally speaking, when they were kind of invented and being developed, it was a wide range of individuals that are being served. People who don't need as much care as, say, the nursing home. But in our state, as in other states, that demographic has shifted tremendously. 60,000 people are served in housing and services in our state, only 30,000 in nursing homes. And
so the other 30,000 are in some kind of assisted living or housing with services?
60,000 people live in housing with services.
Oh, so really?
And 30,000 live in nursing homes. So there's close to 100,000 people in these types of facilities. And in assisted living, the regulations are not as stringent or strict as nursing homes. And yet the population that's being served there, the acuity and the level of need has grown dramatically over the last 20 years and even in the last 5 to 10.
When I look at what's going on here, the regulations are fairly loose for the housing with services and assisted living.
One of the first problems is it's very confusing. Our state is really the only state that doesn't license assisted living in the traditional way. There's not, you can't go to the statute books and find one license to say, this is assisted living, this is the physical plant standards, this is how you have to keep your food, this is what the staff has to be trained, this is what the manager has to know.
Really? So there's no rule like that?
What happens is there's two sets of rules. There is a registration process for the building, but it's not really a license. There's not really someone coming and inspecting your building per se, as you would in a nursing home. And then there is a license for the services that are being offered. And those services and those licenses are overseen by the health department. But of course, one of the problems has been enforcing those standards. And also the fact that there's not kind of a uniform, under kind of one roof, someone in charge. It's tough for regulators to sometimes know if they even have jurisdiction over an issue.
So, to determine whether it's an assisted living problem or it's a license problem. I mean, so that they don't know who's in charge, basically. Is it the building or is it the people?
Yeah, that can oftentimes happen. So say, for example, a fire safety code or a building problem or a door in a memory care unit that should be locked, everyone's told locked, but it's not working. Well, that was management's problem because the door wasn't fixed, or, well, that was the provider's problem because they weren't watching the people.
Okay, so provider is the people who provide the services and management takes care of the building. So
yeah, and every place will use terminology a little differently. Again, one of the, I think is pretty demonstrable about our conversation is confusion runs amok. And of course, when consumers are looking for these places, they don't really know what housing and services necessarily means. Assisted living is used in our state as a term because places can hold themselves out as assisted living if they follow some standards. But one of the big takeaways from the Consumer Work Group report was we need one license, and there needs to be one entity that is in charge and accountable for that.
Of both the building and the services.
Correct.
And that is the case at most other states?
Most other states. Now, of course, that doesn't solve all other problems. Just because other states are having licensed doesn't mean they don't have complaints and elder abuse. We know, for example, things like staffing ratios, making sure that there's enough staff to take care of the level of need of the individuals in the building, knowing what the level of need is of individuals, so having an assessment of that need on the front end, those are really important factors. And so just because you have a new license doesn't necessarily mean people are going to be safer. You also need the devil in the details, and the guts of that licensing system needs to be strong.
Well, the concern that people seem to have was that either the staff wasn't very well trained in the assisted living facilities. And is there some sort of a certificate that the workers have to have?
There's some basic training standards. One of the key gaps, however, is the population being served in housing and services is growing increasingly with individuals with dementia and other forms of cognitive impairment. And we know probably about 40% of those served in housing services, in assisted living in Minnesota, have some level of cognitive impairment or dementia. And the training and standards around that are not nearly where they need to be. The Alzheimer's Association was one of the consumer groups on our workforce and are pushing strong, and we recommend strongly to have some across-the-board training and standards for dementia care, both for places that hold themselves out, and also people with dementia live in all sorts of places that aren't necessarily memory care specific.
Well, and people don't always know that people have a cognitive disability either.
And cognitive disabilities are not uniform. You have good days and bad days, and they manifest incredibly differently.
Well, now, I remember back in the day when high school kids used to work a lot in nursing homes. That was a good job that you could get in the summer and so on. I don't know how much training those young people had, and I don't know if that still happens.
So training is an issue. I would say one of the biggest issues is pay, compensation.
Right, exactly.
And then this is certainly no secret that many state agencies are aware of this problem. The provider industry is certainly aware of this problem. The lack of workforce, the lack of availability because of the low wages in many communities. If people aren't paid enough, it's tough work. It can be very tough work, both emotionally and physically. And so individuals will find a little higher wage and a little easier job.
So in other words, it's a fairly transient workforce then?
It can be. There are providers who create cultures of caring and cultures of accountability, and pay their staff well. And so there are individual providers, I think, who do a great job.
So now, how do you find those people? I mean, that seems to be one of the things that people said, I thought this was a great place for mom or whatever.
Yeah.
And what are some of the things that people should look for?
One of the things that our report highlighted and that is really important is that there's not a lot of consumer protection in this industry.
It's a Wild West.
And so consumer protection laws are important in all sorts of, vehicles or housing or whatever. But here, one of the real gaps is that there's no prohibition against kind of or regulation around the marketing and how things are sold.
Right.
And so it's really easy as a family member. Think about the tough decision that a lot of families go through. To have a loved one move out of their home, sometimes family home that they've been in maybe for decades, into a facility. And so one of the things that families look for right away is, does it feel nice? Are the drapes wonderful? Is there a nice warm fireplace? How are the rooms? Those are important, no doubt. But the questions they don't always ask and are not necessarily told up front is, what's your staffing ratio like? What's your expertise in caring for people with cognitive issues? What happens here after 6 months if mom starts to show mom starts to wander off, as we've seen her do?
Mm-hmm.
Will you be able to care for her, and tell me how? Give me some references of some of other families who live here. I want to talk with them and how long they've been here and what they like about the place.
But now, as I read these incidents of these people at the end of the report, I was horrified because they thought they had done due diligence and people lied to them.
And that is
I don't know, lying is a little serious, but they were completely honest.
So that you're accurate, and of course, just asking questions oftentimes, because there's no strong enforcement or prohibition on some of, especially on the marketing side of things, people are not given.
I don't think there's anything. I mean, that was one of the things I read, is that and that was one of the laws that they went to get enforced, some sort of truth in advertising.
Essentially, and the other big thing that we have pushed and are pushing is also the ability to enforce. Now, all of these licensing regulations, whether it's nursing homes or whether it's these kind of state regulatory systems over assisted living, they come with some form of consumer bills of rights or resident bills of rights. Now, these are important, but in many times they're toothless, because if a right is infringed, where do you go? Well, they say call the health department. Well, the health department has a tough time keeping up with all of their basic services, let alone violations of rights. And so we think that, as in other consumer areas, individuals should have the ability to pursue violations of rights in court.
And then the next thing that we come to is retaliation.
So right now, in our statute books in Minnesota, there are a couple of different prohibitions on retaliation, but they're scattered and they're different and they're tough to enforce.
Well, let's talk about what retaliation is first.
Sure. Well,
if I say that mom isn't getting the kind of care and I complain to somebody, then I might be retaliated against by having, well, all right, if you don't like it, you can move mom someplace else.
So we hear that version of that story a lot, both in our office and when we talked with the public and asked for input as the report was being written. And what you hear is that individuals are very scared, can be very scared to talk about their care or complain about their care because maybe they're asked to leave. Maybe they notice that certain things don't happen as frequently. The cares come a little less frequently than they used to. There's little kind of subtle ways, or the interactions aren't as warm as they used to be. So there's subtle, and then there's also pretty egregious, and that is, you complain, and then the next day you're told that you need to leave. And everywhere in between does happen. So we're really talking about the retaliation when someone is advocating for better care for themselves.
So then what is the remedy for this?
Well, as I was alluding to, really not much. I mean, the Bill of Rights says you shouldn't be retaliated against for trying to enforce your rights, but that's not fleshed out in any kind of robust way.
There's nothing that says, and if you do it, and it can be proved, then you lose your license or you have to pay a fine or something.
That, we just don't see that happen. We need, we're pushing for kind of stronger administrative remedies like that, but we also think that individuals need to also be able to take matters into their own hands through a court action if it's egregious enough. The other area that's really missing in assisted living, and this is really stark because nursing home residents have this protection, but in our state, housing services, assisted living residents don't. And that is some basic due process rights when it comes to being evicted or having your services terminated. In a nursing home, there's only a handful of reasons they can evict you or kick you out. And if you don't agree, if you don't think that they tell you, well, you violated one of these rules, or here's one of the reasons why, and you say that's not true, you can go to an appeal. And in housing with services, you don't have those same protections. They don't have to, they can essentially not renew your lease for any reason.
So if you're causing too much trouble, you can be asked to leave.
Yeah, and there's some basic protections against.
But the nursing home has a flat out.
That federal law I was alluding to spells out the reasons. The only reasons you can be discharged from the nursing facility are X, Y, and Z. And if you disagree with the reasoning, you can have an appeal. There's a notice that has to happen. There's time periods. There's all these protections. We know in assisted living, oftentimes somebody might go to the hospital for either a quick checkup or a situation, come home to find that they're locked out because they don't want them back, or we'll call the hospital and say, don't bother coming back because we're not going to renew your lease.
And so the person then is just literally
go
left
find
on the curb, so to speak.
So to speak.
Yeah, well, now, is there some sort of, how can you tell if you've been abused? I mean, it's, they talk about criminal abuse, and is it, and they also talk about psychological abuse.
So this is a very good question and a tough question. Especially in care facilities, sometimes it's tough to know, am I just not getting good care, or is there something more happening? One of the tools that can and should be used more is a robust care plan, what that does is it gives the individual themselves and also the facility and any other family members kind of an idea of what really good care for this individual looks like. And it should be person-centered. And the rules around kind of these care plans are also fairly loose, and that would be one of the things that a licensing statute could strengthen.
So that everybody should have one.
So yeah, and so then X, Y, and Z has happened to me. My care plan says, this should be happening. It's pretty clear that something is wrong here.
So that you, family member or the person themselves says, this is what I need, or this is what I want, or whatever, and then it's developed that way. Is that right? Yeah. Well, now, so then, I guess, so we're talking about good service. Can you tell if a place has had complaints lobbied against it? Is there any kind of way that you can find that out?
So the health department keeps track of the reports, and you can search the health department's website. Admittedly, it's not the easiest functionality. One of the issues being discussed, I don't anticipate it'll happen fast, is a consumer report card project, right, so that you could kind of, similar to how child care centers have grades or certain stars to them, you could search facilities that way. But that's a long ways off. For individual consumers, the best thing to do is ask other people who've lived there. I would do a health department search. It's the Minnesota Department of Health and Office of Health Facility Complaints. But if you put Minnesota Department of Health Assisted Living search, you can find the dashboard.
Now, something that I saw in your report was that the number of complaints has gone up a lot.
Yeah, so
is that because the care is getting worse, or because people need more care and aren't getting it?
I think there hasn't been a definitive study done on the why. I think it's pretty clear a number of things are happening. The acuity level that I mentioned before of individuals in facilities is higher than it used to be. The number of individuals in less regulated settings, the housing and services, who need more help than those places potentially were designed to do, at least on the forefront, is increasing. Awareness is increasing. I think providers have been also trained to file reports often. So 400 reports are filed every week. Every week. A lot of those reports wouldn't be abuse or neglect. There would be certain kind of licensing violations, but in that 400 there are significant issues as well, and it's up to the health department to quickly sort through all
That's
of that.
That's what I was going to ask. Is the staffing sufficient at the health department?
So one of the big changes that has happened since those articles that you mentioned is the Office of Health Facility Complaints in the health department is retooling. They have readily admitted before these changes they were still using a paper-based system with stacks of actual written complaints in the office. They've had to do a huge process improvement. They got some help from the Department of Human Services in a fairly unprecedented collaboration, and they have ramped up both their staffing and their process and their efficiency. So they've currently reported that they are working through those 400
Because they were like a year behind.
They had a large backlog, plus they're actually addressing those reports and how to do it, because it can be difficult.
I would think it would take a while. It's not something that you could just make one phone call and everything will be good.
No, it has taken them a long time to work through that backlog, and now they have to make sure that they stay on pace with the 400 reports, and especially the egregious cases within that. And one of the things that we really stressed in our report is you can fix the regulatory system all you want, but you also need to address some root causes and look at prevention issues. So that's why stronger licensing laws, taking a look at what staffing ratios actually are in facilities, making sure that individuals have rights, stronger rights that they can enforce, are all tools to make sure more on the front end and upstream problems are fixed.
Now, do you think that the residents really have rights? I mean, they do theoretically have rights, but...
Well, so one of the things I like to tell people when I talk about this issue is I will pull out the Bill of Rights. There's several. There's over a dozen of them, maybe more than that. And I ask, okay, so what happens when this right here is violated? What do you do? Well, maybe you can make a complaint of those 400, but will that rise to the level of, and by the time they come out and investigate it and do anything, you've left or the issue's resolved, so let alone for you or others that issue's not solved. So I would say the rights exist on paper, but because the enforcement mechanisms are so weak, essentially people, as you mentioned earlier, and as we've heard from people, they sometimes live in fear from advocating for themselves and actually pushing those rights forward.
Well, and I guess, can you find out if a facility has had reports made of abuse?
Yeah, so doing a search of the health departments.
Then you could find that out.
Yeah.
Well, and we should talk a little bit about proposed legislation, because the session is just about, well, it is underway now, so.
It is, yeah. So as I mentioned last year in 2018, the consumer groups pushed forward legislation to try to enact our recommendations in the report. Those did not get picked up. What happened was both the House and the Senate had versions of elder protections. Some of our ideas from the report were picked up, others were not. At the end of the day, there was something proposed. It was put in the omnibus bill that was vetoed, along with 1,000 other pages. So what has happened in the interim is the health department has convened a lot of the stakeholders in this world and this issue, and tried to work through some of the real sticking points. Consumer advocates don't always agree with the industry perspective on how things should change. And we're going to see some of those issues now play out, I think, in 2019 for sure. So issues around licensing assisted living. Will it happen? And if it happens, I think most people are in agreement that it needs to happen. How is that going to look? What's it actually going to entail? Consumer rights and enforcement of those rights, including that right to those discharge protections that I was alluding to earlier, will be key. So those issues will be, I think, debated robustly this session.
So if you were a consumer and you were unhappy with something that happened to yourself or to your family member, how would you be able to figure out what legislation you should be pushing? Do you have a website? We will show your website actually at the end of the show. Is there anything on there that would help people?
Yeah, so our office gives legislative updates about what's happening.
In language that the average person can understand?
Yeah, we definitely try to do that. There are other consumer groups working on this issue. AARP, if you've opened up the Star Tribune recently, is one of their main priorities. They also have a lot of good citizen advocacy avenues, as well as the Alzheimer's Association I mentioned, Elder Voice Family Advocates, and Legal Aid. Those are the 5 consumer groups that formed last year around this issue. But AARP's also has a lot of organizing around this issue.
Now, I noticed one of my notes here, it says deceptive marketing practices should be prohibited. Is that going to be part of the legislation too, that there's going to be something around that?
Well, it was certainly part of the consumer work group's legislation last session, and because it's so important that you shouldn't have people making false statements in this industry, and then you should have a way to actually enforce that. That will be one of the consumer rights that is brought back.
And if you did make a successful suit, I mean, I noticed that even if the facility admitted or they were charged with causing someone's death, the maximum payout would be $5,000. I mean, is that all a life is worth?
Well, so what you're alluding to is the fine, the penalty that the administrative agency would levy against the licensee. What I'm talking about is the ability to bring an individual lawsuit when
you can bring a lawsuit at you as an individual, and hopefully there will be no retaliation.
Yeah, and of course you can bring a lawsuit if someone has caused somebody's death. But when it comes to actually enforcing your consumer rights in this world, it's a lot more murky and a lot more difficult to do. So we want to make that easier.
Well, you can see that there are a lot of changes, hopefully, coming along through the legislative process. But I hope that this has helped you to learn how you can be a more active consumer of services from if you have a person or you yourself are looking at getting some kind of assisted living facility. So we want to thank our guest this evening for being with us, Sean Burke from the Minnesota Elder Justice Center. Thanks for being with us. And thank you for tuning in to We the People. This is Joan Higginbotham for the League of Women Voters saying thanks for viewing. We hope you'll tune in again. Good night.